We'll start with the basics of Conduit. So I thought I'd start by just showing you a quick diagram that I sketched up while I was making notes. I think it helps give a little context to the tool, and it helps us maybe define what its behavior is. But fundamentally, Conduit is it's a tool that we at OpenLMS built a long time ago, and and it's designed to be a processing center for inbound student data. So records about users, courses, and enrollments, and some ancillary records as well. We'll dive into all of those types. Are set up to be handled or processed by Conduit. Conduit will process those with create commands, delete commands, and update commands to manage those records in the system for us. And so it's really a pathway to integrating data from some external source, a student information system, or a human resources information system, some sort of sign-up process, whatever it is, the spreadsheet that you've got with information, however sophisticated or simple it might be. To take that data about who's supposed to be in a place doing what and funnel it into the teaching and learning environment. And that's really what Conduit's all about. It's a connector. And so data comes from some source, whatever that source might be, and it channels its way to Conduit. Conduit does its business and then channels information into the learning platform itself. And that's, in a nutshell, what it's all about. There are lots of other little gizmos and features and widgets that we're going to dive into, but at a very high level, it's really about a way to send data from the source through to the LMS and have some hopefully high-value benefits to using that tool. And we'll talk about some of those benefits. We'll talk about the way that this architecture works, and we'll talk about how the data transacts back and forth. Because there is actually, my arrows are only going one direction, but there is an option to think about pulling data out as well. And so Conduit has a lot of flexibility in the way that it's been designed over the years to support lots of different kind of working models of how we want to approach data. And so fundamentally, Conduit is an external database to the Moodle database, is the kind of jargony way to think of these things. It has its own set of tables that it holds records in, and then it uses rules within it that you define to determine how it processes those records into the Moodle environment itself, into the space. What happens when a new record comes in is determined by the settings, and then that change propagates based on the way things are configured and set up. Hopefully, as we go through this, you'll get a really good insight into the way to configure things if you don't have them configured already, as well as to have an opportunity to think about how changes to the tool over time have come along and that you may need to change, or you have an opportunity to change your existing process to leverage some new functionality in the tool. So that's about, I have my Conduit block on the page. I'm going to go into the settings space on the page, and that's where I can control a lot of the behavior. Settings is about what Conduit does with the data that it gets. Once I've gotten a record from the outside system, what do I do about it? And potentially the answer is that Conduit does nothing. So, and there are scenarios that people want that to be the case. I'm not fond of those scenarios necessarily, but they are reasonable in their own right, and it makes sense for that to happen. And there are ways to configure Conduit so that you're passing data to Conduit, but you don't want Conduit to take any action about that. Sure, I would wonder why you're sending the record over there at all, but that's okay. You can do any of these things you'd want to. One of the first tips I'm going to throw out is around this remove logs behavior. Remove logs is a setting that, I mean, it's been around for a while, but it feels a bit like a new setting because I think it's a setting that folks haven't noticed. If you have a relatively new site, if you've been around for a few years or less, this setting probably is set to archive and probably has some number of months by the default in it, probably like 3 or 6 months or something. If your site is older, if you've been around for many, many years like my site had been, that setting might be off. It might be set to never remove logs. You'll notice a performance issue with the reporting interface if you're not ever truncating those logs. This is a tool that truncates the transaction logs after some time frame that you define. Maybe 4 months, 6 months, whatever number of months it is that you want to trim the logs off. I reflexively always choose archive. That way the logs that I get rid of are written to log archive file on the SFTP mount for my site. So I can always go in through SFTP and grab that archived log file and hold on to it. I also have a box of cables from 1990s on sitting in my closet. So maybe it's not actually a good choice. Maybe it's the kind of choice that I'm predisposed to make. And in fact, that box of cables is relatively untouched, except to periodically shove more cables into it. So that's sort of how the archive winds up working, I think, as well, is that over time, you probably just keep shoving archive files into the SFTP mount, but not ever doing anything with them. So it's up to you. Set a policy that makes sense. Think about your data retention in one context, but fundamentally, the logs is about the transaction records of what happened in the Conduit. You really only need it for determining the source of a problem that came up. Something happened in a transaction or some record should have been created, but it didn't get created. Why did that happen? Stuff like that. So how long do you really need to retain those transactions? Probably not terribly long. Oh yeah, great question, Joe. Where did they go? The little help button here will tell me. So the data root is your SFTP path, and then it's going to be in a directory called archive, and inside of that conduit, and inside of that logs. So it'll be nested down inside the little rabbit hole. So if you head into SFTP, there should be a directory called archive that contains a subdirectory for conduit and logs where those files get put. Oh, yeah, you know, my site probably needs me to go up there and delete an awful lot of junk out of the folder, to be honest. But they're also not taking up tons of space on my site because my transaction logs are pretty lightweight. If your transaction logs are pretty heavy with activity, then you definitely want to consider trimming your logs, and you probably will want to have some sort of cleanup routine where you go up into that space, download and archive those transaction logs, or throw them out. Again, one of the big reasons to do this trimming on the reports is that it improves the performance of the reporting engine overall, right? If I'm scanning 10 years of transaction logs every time you try to open up the reports, it could take 5-10 minutes to load the reporting page as it churns through all of those transaction logs and transaction history. And in fact, do you need to go back 10 years in transaction history to see what happened in a transaction 10 years ago? Probably not. It's a relatively unreasonable scenario. So, but I might need to go back, 3-6 months, something like that. And that's perfectly reasonable to hold on to as active searchable data. So that's the intent of this setting, is to really improve the performance of the reporting engine inside of the conduit and give you a way to kind of manage and trim the transaction information. Speaking of those transactions, there are notification settings in here as well. The notification settings are about being able to be warned or notified when stuff is going on. This was one of the foundational elements of building Conduit, was the intention that one of the challenges of a lot of other transaction systems to get user records into the system don't really, basically none of them have any really good ways to let me know something went wrong, other than for me to go find out that something broke. And that's never terribly satisfying. So we built into the tool the ability to set up warnings. So you can choose to set it to none, so you'll never get any notifications. You can choose to set it to all, so that every single thing that happens with the system sends you some sort of notification. Some people love that. I'm not one of those people, but some people love them. Or you can get notifications on errors and warnings, or just errors only and not warnings. It's up to you to tune that setting to the frequency of information that you want to get. Warnings, and we'll touch on this as we get into the mappings, warnings can contain an awful lot of situations that are not a problem, that you're not concerned about. And so that's why we created that differentiation between just errors and errors plus warnings, so that you've got the ability to kind of decide that operationally you're going to run the system in a way that it's going to generate warning notifications frequently, and you don't want to hear about it. You only want to hear about the error conditions. What's great is that it allows you to choose that setup. You can stick with whatever you pick. You can modify it over time as you decide that things are going wrong. And then over here, you can choose who's getting those notifications. So I'm getting emails whenever an error or a warning happens in the system. It doesn't happen frequently for me. It'll probably have spikes. And the only way that you can choose a person to send that to is for that account with that email address to be an administrator on the site. So there's not a sort of support for an optional, but you could create an account that no one logs into that has the email address that you want to send those notifications to. And that's what I would do for an automation agent, or like, let's say you wanted to send notifications to Zapier about transactions, right? So you could create an account in here with the email address for the Zapier collector, just for Zapier to use, and then choose it to be the one that you send those emails out to. In that case, if you were sending out to an automated agent like Zapier or something like that, you probably will also want to include a attachment file, so that that automated system has a file to consume with the information that you're trying to parse. You can set it up to send a tab delimited file, or a comma delimited file, or no file at all. For me, since they're sending me notifications, I choose no file because I'm going to have to come in and read the report anyway, so the file doesn't really do me any good. And Carrie, I recommend file and web service is a way to get notifications whenever essentially something gets processed, is what it's doing. So whenever new data, that's one of the settings in here, whenever new data is sent to Conduit, you're going to get a notification about that. That's a perfectly reasonable approach, because you might have an automated system that's sending data, so you want to get a notification whenever new data is sent. It's up to you, frankly, and it's a perfectly good way to go at it, so that you're always aware that it's processing something new. It's definitely not an unusual one. Yeah, Angela, it's right in there too, right? You're using it as well. it's a perfectly reasonable way to go at it. And in fact, you can get all transactions. There's also non-empty transactions. So any transaction, there are ways in which the system can be set up to run a process that comes back and says there was nothing to do. And those are empty transactions. And so you can say, well, don't tell me about empty transactions. Just tell me about every transaction that isn't an empty transaction. File and web service is everything except direct edits of the system. So there is sort of an extra layer that you could be capturing, which is directly editing the tables. And we'll take a look at how to do the direct editing later on, but that's a good one. And exactly, Angela, it's about having a confirmation flag, right? You know that the process completed because you got a confirmation. It's a completely reasonable way to go at it. For me, on my side, I set it up to errors and warnings because whenever something transacts on my site, it's because I did it. So I already know that it happened. I just wanted to tell me when it happened and it went wrong. so that's all I care about for my side. But that's because that's how I've got my stuff set up. Yeah, so I think it's a great way to go with file and web service because you've got a transaction record receipt of it working. And particularly, again, it depends on how you're set up at your institution. It gives you a little bit of cover, but it also gives you an opportunity to have, oftentimes, someone else is in charge of that database that's sending those transactions. So this is a way for you to get notifications about that process interacting, right? So you know when that database that you probably potentially even have no control over or visibility in is doing something that's updating this environment. So it's a great way to get those notifications. So cool. I like these questions too. They're really great. I want to plunge in here a little deeper. So I feel like I'm sliding behind on my face. I've been talking too much. but that's pretty normal for me. So one of the things that's fundamental in Conduit is that I also have the ability to determine what the lookup fields are. So this is creating the key record value between the two tables, is what I do. I'm telling Conduit user records are identified by ID number on my site. By default, it would be username instead of ID number, but I've got mine set to ID number. You can also set it up to be email. Whatever your system is going to use as the key identity of the user account is what you'll want to set that to. Since I have mine set up to say the user field is the ID number, whenever I refer to a user in my transactions, I refer to that user by ID number only. If I refer to users in most of my transactions by their email address instead, we use the email address. But I think ID number is actually a fairly common approach, or people set the username to be the ID number of the user record in the other system. And so it's fair to refer to them by username because it's consistent. It's how you're going to reference these objects. Courses can be referenced by short name or ID number. Roles can be referenced by name or short name. Now, you also have full ability inside the system as an administrator to change both the short name and the full name of roles. So you can make the role named whatever you need it to make named, either short name or full name. It doesn't really matter. But you're going to go ahead and set that up. If you decide partway through the process that you want to change that setting to something new, that's not a problem. I mean, it can be tricky to do that, but it's not a problem. You're not locked into this forever. So, for example, if I wanted to switch to username, I can switch to username. When I hit save here, it's going to give me a warning and say, hey, I found a bunch of records that don't have the right field to map against this, or non-unique usernames have been used across multiple records or whatever. It'll give me a warning with a report of the conflicts that are going to be caused by making that change. And so I can go address those issues and then come back and make the change and save it because I fixed the things that are going to break. Traditionally, it's more that you've had it set up with username and you're trying to switch to ID number, and it'll come back and say, well, here's the list of all the records that don't have an ID number field. So you have to give them an ID number before you can change to the ID number being the key record value. It makes sense. But what's cool is that it gives you a report. It tells you pretty clearly what the issues are and how to fix them. And if it comes back with something really crazy, book a support ticket. And they'll come in and help you figure it out. Every once in a while, things go kind of squirrely in there. So yeah, it's fine. For the user fields, the user records, again, the settings are telling the system, when you get a record, what do you do? How do you process it? And some of the big highlights are really the only ones that we're going to talk about here. When an external record is removed, what do I do? So really what this is saying is when you send a transaction to Conduit and you say delete this user, what do you want Conduit to do with that user inside of Movie? And so mine says suspend the internal. So when I delete someone off of the user table in Conduit, they are set to a suspended state inside of OpenLMS so that the user account can't be logged into anymore. But it keeps the account around so that I can still, like if I go back and look at the log file, the user's name will show up in the transaction because the account still exists. So it can look up the account for the name, put it in the log file view. You also can keep the internal, so you just do nothing with the internal record inside of OpenLMS when you delete them, or you can delete the account entirely. So you can just say, well, I said delete, so actually meant delete. There you go. It's kind of up to you. How do you want to approach this? There are advantages and disadvantages to deleting the account. Deleting them creates a sense of tidiness and synchronicity between the two views, right? So the account has been deleted out of Conduit, therefore they have been deleted. They're out of the system, and I don't see them anymore. They're gone. In fact, when you delete a record, like a user record inside of OpenLMS, you're really flagging it as deleted, so the database still has that record in there, but it's modified so that it's deleted, and it's modified to clean up some of the personal information in it. You can recover that account by recreating the account with the same primary information, username and email. Yeah, it's up to you, whatever you prefer. I will say the suspend is nice because it allows you to see those users, but to Iggy, to your question, it doesn't ever remove suspended accounts. It just leaves them in a suspended state indefinitely. So they're there kind of forever until I go in and I can search for them and then delete them manually out of OpenLMS. So you could set up a day every year to go in and just say, all right, take all the suspended accounts and collect them together and delete them. However you want to tackle that. From licensing or contractual viewpoint, an account that is suspended, it does not count against your user count, so we don't care. So I guess you don't care. I don't know. Right. So, and exactly, Josh, and that's what I'm talking about, is if that account is suspended, it's still there for the system to use when I do things like restore things, look at data in the log files. The, the identity of the user is preserved because the record is preserved. It's just in a suspended state. The downside is it's just more users in the system than I perhaps need to have in the system. Like, clutters up my view of user reports, it clutters up my view of who's in the system. It, it feels a little unwieldy. And I'll show you another view in the system where we can see those users and talk about it a little more. But there are reasons to go both directions on that. And there are actually reasons to have it do nothing when you delete the conduit user. Fundamentally, it's set up to support whatever approach you want to take. I like suspension because it works for me. So, yeah. Yeah. So there are a lot of other choices that you can make in here around managing like passwords and sending out new passwords and things like that. I'm not going to dive into those too much. There's a lot of reasons that you might choose to set those up, but I don't think they're very common to be used. But the update all user account setting is one I'll mention. It should be set to yes, unless you have some special reason to not set it to yes. What that does is it means that Conduit can update records that are not assigned to Conduit authentication. So if you have records, right, if I'm using Conduit to load records into the system, and those records are going to be authenticated against our Active Directory accounts, I'm going to set their authentication to Active Directory when I make them. And if I say update all user accounts to no, then as soon as I made them, they're gone. Conduit, they're invisible to me. I don't care. I'm never going to see them again. and so it's useful to say yes to that. I find it to be the exceptional case where I want to say no defines itself well enough that it makes sense to set it to no. Otherwise, just set it to yes. Yeah, and so Iggy, it is, the suspended user is in the database, but storage-wise, it's not really different because the user record when it's deleted is essentially the same amount of information as the user record when it's suspended, which is roughly the same amount of information as when the user is active in the system from the user table viewpoint, which is why we're not really into splitting hairs about deleted accounts versus suspended accounts from our perspective, because from a usage standpoint, they represent the same thing. A deleted user can't use the system and add more activity. A suspended user can't use the system and can't add more activity, and they both take up roughly the same amount of space inside the database. So it's about the same. Because again, when I delete a user, it obfuscates the email address and the name of the user in the database, so that if the database was exposed, that information is not there. But it keeps the record intact, and so it's essentially the same object. It's kind of complicated. Any other questions about user settings? I've kind of glossed over the password ones, but does anyone have questions about password settings or kind of want to use them? Because if not, I'll skip them. Fair enough. Personally, I don't like passing passwords this way, except for my purposes, which are to do things like build demonstration accounts. the passwords for all those. So hopefully you're authenticating users through some cool authentication source anyway. So it shouldn't be a big problem. Thinking about courses and course creation activities is kind of the next big thing in there. And there are a few settings to think about in here. There's a lot of creation behavior. So if we think about, there's an auto-create course, auto-update course, auto-delete course, auto-archive course, and auto-create category flagging. There's a lot of different settings. Mine are all set to yes. Maybe yes, maybe no. It's up to you. Let's think about these. So auto-create courses, yes. One might argue, why even have that as a setting? Because why am I sending courses to Conduit if I'm not using Conduit to make them? I don't really know either. But there is a perfectly valid reason to think of courses as already existing, and I'm just trying to connect the course object in the external system to the one inside the LMS through Conduit, and so I don't need to make the course, I just want it to have the same record as I've already got. Sure, that makes sense, I guess. Not a likely scenario though. But I want to tell the system to make courses when I tell it to create courses. I want to tell the system to update courses based on updates that I send through. And I want to tell the system to delete courses when I delete them from Conduit. Again, right, I could say no to that. So when I delete it from Conduit, I just remove it from the table, but the course stays in the system. And I'm managing the course manually some other way. That's fine. It's perfectly reasonable to set that to yes or to no, right? Auto archive is a behavior I've talked about in the backups seminars previously. Auto archive is a way to tell the system to make a backup of the course before it executes a deletion. It's sort of your opportunity to take one last snapshot of the course before you remove it from the system entirely. It's a nice thing. Those will go to that archive conduit path in the SFTP space, and it'll be in the courses folder instead of the logs folder, where we're going to hold on to those archive backups. This is stuff that you need to clean up to keep your storage in the clean, sorted order. So, you know, use it if it makes sense. Don't use it if you don't want to manage that extra storage. Also consider that when you send a batch of deletions to the system, if you're archiving the course prior to deletion, you're kind of doubling the process time of that job, because it's going to make a backup and then delete rather than just delete the course. So, you know, it's nice, it's comforting. I use it mostly to test it, because mostly when I'm deleting things from my site, it's because it's junk anyway. but I'm not running real courses on my site, so yes, it makes sense. If I were you, I would probably be doing automated backups of courses anyway, so I probably don't need the auto archive, but you could think of auto archive as a substitution for those automated backups. Turn off automated backups, turn on auto archive. Whenever you delete a course through Conduit, you're going to get a snapshot of that course prior to deletion, and then you can manage those backups at the end of the term when you delete courses out of the system. Yeah, exactly. So, and that's it. Summary is that auto backups save your bacon when somebody does something crazy. There is a recycle bin for deleted courses also, but it won't work for courses that you delete through Conduit. So if that accident was somebody pushing the button in the administrative interface to delete a course, the recycle bin will catch that and allow you to restore the course. If the accident was somebody accidentally pushed a button in something that told Conduit to delete the course, and then Conduit just deletes the course. So, and it bypasses the recycle bin process. So yeah, there's auto backups. I like the confirmation and the knowledge that the backups are being made. I like the ability to connect it to the Amazon S3 storage container for the backups to just automatically go to my Amazon space, where I can have rules in Amazon that say, when a backup is 7 days old, put it in Glacier storage where it costs 2/100ths of a penny per gigabyte or something ridiculous like that, to store stuff there. Um, it's a great way to go. And I feel confident then that I know stuff's going on. In which case, I can just turn off the auto archive completely because I know that I've already got backups of that course and I need yet another backup of that course. I guess with my security dude hat on, I would say, while it's tempting to make lots of backups of things, every backup of a file is a potential to leak confidential personal information. And so the more backups you make and put in different places, it's just more stuff you gotta wrangle security-wise. So, do what you gotta do. Auto create category is one of those settings that I think is kind of funny, but it is a setting, and you can set it to yes or no. You can specify a category in the course creation command, and when you specify that category, you can, with this setting, tell the system to make the category if it doesn't already exist. It's kind of cool. It's nice. It's kind of handy to have. Reasons to have it on no is because you've manually created all the categories you want, and if anything's coming over with the wrong category specification in its name, you don't want it to make some weird random category by accident. So you want to shove that course where it belongs. I sort of feel like you got other problems to sort out there as well, but hey, it works. And it works perfectly well. So there you go. You can create categories on the fly. There's a category separator that you can define whatever's coming over in the message to define the category name. You can define the separator, so category, subcategory definitions. Parents is a legacy element. It's sort of an appendix, if you will. Once upon a time, many, many versions of Moodle ago, when you made parent and child course relationships, you had to point the child course at the parent. And so when you did that, you had to do it with the path. And so there's a separator for that path as an option. You don't do it that way anymore, so it doesn't really matter. Don't worry about this setting, to be honest. It's a bit of a legacy. It's there because it kind of needs to be there still, but it's not of any use. Newer settings, hide course after end date. Course end dates are a cool setting that Moodle added to the course objects. It also doesn't really do much of anything. So we put a setting inside a Conduit that says, if you have a course that has an end date, do you want Conduit to automatically update that course? So update courses has to be set to yes. You want to have us automatically update that course to hide the course when the end date passes. And you could say yes to that, and then that's what Conduit will do. When you hit that threshold for when the course end date happens, Conduit will automatically update the visibility of the course to off, and poof, the course goes away for its students. It's kind of handy. It's kind of nice. It's also a bit nerve-wracking because it's automation that's doing stuff that you're not necessarily thinking about. So, I can see either way. It's perfectly reasonable to feel that way about it. Last up, let's talk about templates. Templating is a way to not just create an empty course on Create Course, but to create a course as a copy of an existing course in the system. You can define a default template so that if you don't specify a template for a new course, it will always choose this course as the default. If you have a strong instructional design focus, an instructional design team on the campus, and they built a generic default template for all instructors to use to build new courses from, that's a great example of what to put into this default template space. And then if you don't pass a specific template to the course to be used, it will assume the default and create the course from that master course. It's a nice way to go. It gives people a shortcut on their course, kind of gives them an easy start to things. Things to be wary of when you choose restore, right? The options are no, which turns it off, current version, and backup. If you say current version in the restore process, so you say restore from current version, it'll take the backup of the course as it is today and make that the thing that it uses as the template. Whereas if you say restore from backup, it'll look to see if it has this backup file with the name that's specified in the template name. And if it does, it'll use that backup. If it doesn't exist, it'll create a new one and then keep using it from there on out. Advantages and disadvantages viewpoint. If I'm restoring from backup and I did it 3 years ago for the first time, that backup file from 3 years is the one it's going to keep using. So if I've made changes to the course over time, I need to delete the backup that Conduit uses and allow it to make a fresh backup each time I make a change. So it's a thing I need to do in my process, right? But the advantage of using restore from backup is that if I say restore from the course each time, I double the process time of every single course that I make through Conduit because it makes a backup, restores the backup, throws the backup away. Makes a backup, restores from the backup, throws the backup away. And so I've now taken a process that was just restoring 100 courses and turned it into a process that is backing up 100 courses and restoring 100 courses. Twice as long. Significant impact in performance, a significant impact in runtimes. It's pretty heavy duty. So my setting and my advice is to use the restore from backup unless you have some really compelling reason to do it otherwise. And then just make sure that you throw away the old backups if you need to refresh what those course pictures or images look like. A new setting in here is the failed course deletion setting. It's set to yes on my side. That means that if, for whatever reason, the restore process fails, you run into a restore that hangs up and dies or crashes partway through the restore, you get that, restore and process course floating around in your system. This setting tells the system, Conduit, when that happens, delete that thing and get it out of my system because I don't want it. So it's kind of nice. You might be tempted to feel like you want to keep that broken course for diagnostics, but in reality, when a course is broken like that, you can't use it to diagnose what went wrong anyway, so it kind of doesn't matter. The transaction log will tell you that there was a failure. It'll give you some information about the failure. Odds are what you're really going to have to do is go find that course, manually run it through a restore with debugging on, and see what broke in the restore process, and try to fix it. So there are a handful of other settings in here about enrollments. You're going to say yes to auto enrollments if you wanted to manage your enrollments, and auto unenroll users, rather, if you wanted to unenroll users. Auto create and update groups if you're going to send groups from the student information system or whatever the external system is through. You're going to want to set it up to make those groups and manage them. So you'll say yes to those. And last but not least is this export button. So it's a really handy tool. It's a good functionality. It just makes a little XML package that you bring in and bring out. Oh, on the enrollments, if I change a course's short name, how can I make sure the enrollments stay attached? Ooh, that's a great one. So you'll have to resend those enrollments with the new short name. This is the bummer of it all. Unless you're naming the course with an ID number, in which case the ID number would stay the same in the two courses, and the enrollments are targeting the ID number because that's the key record for the course. When you make a new short name for a course, it makes a whole new course, just as a word of caution there. To Moodle, short name XYZ and XYZ1 are two entire courses. They're the very rare exceptions to that sort of behavior. Yeah. So one thing to think about is if the short name is the kind of thing that sometimes does change. Think about setting Conduit to use the ID number as the key record value so that the ID number is fixed always, and the short name may change. And then that way, the enrollments will stay linked to that ID number. So yes, Iggy, it should, and it mostly works that way unless Moodle really wants to get involved in that. So that would be the colleague ID number is what you would send in there. Conduit has an ID number that it's going to use as just an index, but that's one that you can supply. Yeah, and you would just map the colleague ID number to the ID number field for the course. Yeah, in fact, that's a nice segue to mapping, which we should take a look at here because we're running along nicely. So I'm going to go ahead and collapse this guy and just go to here. So this is a field that I get to map anyway, so we can go ahead. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it can be problematic if it's rebuilt in colleague. The ID number probably changes in colleague also. So it's not necessarily going to fix your problem. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's just a bit messy. So mappings is the sort of meat to the potatoes of the settings. So the settings is about what do I do when you tell me information. And mappings is you gave me a message, how do I make sense of this information? Part of the deal. Mappings is where you say, when you get a user record and it has a field, email school primary, that field is the email address for the user record in Moodle. And so it's where you define the relationship between the incoming data and the record values that are available inside of Moodle. You're going to have some required fields. It's either username or username and ID number or username and email, depending on what you have set up as the value to be mapped, right? So if it's username, it's just username. If it's ID number, it's username plus ID number, and so on. There always has to be a username, and then it's that plus whatever the record value is. So sort of complicated way of saying there's not a lot that's required here. so you don't, and let's just take a perusal in the user records space. There are 40 plus record spots that you can populate with data if you choose to. But just because the field exists here doesn't mean you have to map a value to it. It's not required. Sort of likewise, in reverse, if your data that's coming over has 13 fields, but you only want to use 10 of them in the student record, you just don't know how to get rid of the other 3. You don't have to map them all. You can just have it ignore the other 3 fields. It will generate a warning every time it sees those records. So back to that, do I want errors or errors and warnings conversation? If I'm sending over records with more fields than I have mapped, Conduit is going to send me a warning about that every single time, right? It's going to say, hey, I know about 10 things, and you sent me a file with 13 things. I don't know what those other 3 are. It's just going to do that every time. Because it's trying to make you aware that there's information that you're sharing with it, but it doesn't know what to do with. So if that's the condition state that you want to be in, you might want to turn off notifications for warnings so that you don't get a warning every time it processes a user account, because it's just noise, right? It's not helpful information at that point. Or go in and figure out how to get rid of those fields, or go in and map those fields to stuff as you may as well. Let's talk about reports really quick. So I mentioned with the truncation behavior to be able to make sure that you get rid of old data out of these. You can see my site here doesn't have a lot of transactions in the last month. I don't really send an awful lot of transactions through, but I can get these error messages, so I can open it up and go, oh, what was that error message about? And it says, oh, I'm already running this transaction or whatever it was. So it looks like maybe I double sent a file, and so it hung up on the transaction and said, oh, well, I'm already doing that transaction, so I'm not going to do it again. So that's the error that it generated. Fair enough. Oh, so there you go. You can filter these on type of message. You can the source in essence. So was it a direct edit of Conduit? Was it a cron processing? Was it a file? Was it a web service? Whatever sent the message over that started it, I can do my filtering based on that. I can also filter based on time sections in there, and then I can see quick pieces in there. And this button that I already clicked on once, this is a related log, right? So this shows me the details of this transaction in depth, right? Pretty nice. And again, here we go. Conduit did a thing, and then a second later, Moodle did a thing. And so it's telling me I should always see 2 transactions for each transaction. I should see Conduit has its interaction with that transaction, and Moodle also has its interaction with that transaction. Unless I'm sending updates and I don't have update Moodle anytime. In which case, I will only see Conduit make updates. A pretty handy report, particularly for doing cleanup and bookkeeping, is the Unmatched Records report. Unmatched Records need to have Conduit tell you about records in either Conduit or Moodle that don't have a match in the other space. So, for example, here, I'm looking at courses and I'm saying, show me a list of every course that's in Moodle that I don't have a record of in Conduit. Right? So it gives me this full long list of all the courses that I've manually created outside of the process of Conduit. It gives me an opportunity to grab those and download them into a file that I could then take and upload back into the system to create a matching record in Conduit that matches the object that I've already got inside of Moodle, right? So it's a nice way to do a little bit of cleanup in there. or I can come in and do a little analysis on what I'm looking at. So let's say, for example, with users, if I look at users, remember my site's set up to suspend users when I delete them from Conduit. So I have a long list of users that are in Moodle that are not in Conduit, and hopefully most all of them have an authentication type of no login, which is the suspended authentication type method. And so that says these users are suspended. They don't exist inside of Conduit. They have been suspended in this no login approach. This would actually be the right view. They're suspended and their authentication is set to no login. So it's kind of a nice thing to know. But it could give me some insights into accounts that have been introduced to the system in some other way. Last kind of use that I think of for this, and sort of really the primary use I think for this report, is to show me all the enrollments that have happened in the system outside of Conduit. So if we allow faculty to manually add students to their courses as kind of a workaround to get students into the course quickly during the add drop times, this would give me a view of every enrollment that's in Moodle that's not in Conduit, and every enrollment that's in Conduit that's no longer in Moodle, right? So somebody could drop manually for whatever reason. So it does give me some pretty good insights into those mismatches between the two different sets of data, and an easy way to synchronize those two sets of data elements to be the same now, so that I can come in and say, oh, well, since we have enrollments that have been manually added to courses, let's go ahead and pull them all out of the system into a file, and then process that file back into Conduit so that now Conduit has a record for each of those enrollments that should have gone through that direction in the first place. Or you could take that file out and take it to the student information system and update the student information system with those enrollments that happen outside of that flow to get them into the correct place. I think in our final minutes, I'm going to talk about the grade report and land us pretty much right on time, which is great. So the grades report is a way to get an export view of all the grades inside the system. It pulls grades for courses, it pulls grades for grade items within the course, manually grade items and category grade items can be selected as well. Pretty typical approach would be to say, I just want the course grades. I don't want the other extra grades. And then I can get a file that I can export out of the system with every course grade that's in the system that I can then take and import into, say, the student information system and bring those grade values in. There are options to control whether or not we show grades that have been deleted. So if the user got removed from the course, the grade gets deleted from the grade history list. And so even though we can still see the grade exists in the view, we might not care about grades that are deleted because that's an enrollment that's been terminated. And so I can tell it, ignore all grades that have been deleted, only show me non-deleted grades. And then here I'm getting all of the different grade groups, right? So percentage grade, letter grade, and the raw score grade. So I can choose which field I want to use to import into the system. It's a nice way to get a big fat extract of all the grades or to focus in on specific groups of courses. For example, if every course in its short name or ID number, depending on what you're using there, has a code that we know will be there for this term, let's say maybe fall 2020, I can sort and filter based on that condition, right? I can say, those are the courses I want to capture. Go back here. You can see it does also give me a sort of dynamic list here of all the courses that are going to match my sort or my search. So I can see that my search term is effective. Yeah, it's kind of handy though. Decent way to grab grades en masse if that fits your workflows. It's a kind of good way to just pull batches of grades out of the system. Again, you can do this pretty granular as well, so you can grab the individual activity grades, manually graded course items, and the category grades as well as that course grade. So you can really kind of drink from the fire hose information there, or you can focus it in on the only part that really matters. So you got some choice. Some good functionality. Any questions on that stuff before I wrap this up for the day? And I thank you for your time. All right. So next week, we're not going to have a session because Thanksgiving is happening in the US. But the week after that, December 2nd, is when we'll have the second session. There's a little bit of homework in the course if you want to check it out and try it. Just try to give you some ideas of things to experiment with in Conduit rather than staring kind of at the blank open space, as it were. Go ahead and take a crack at that assignment if you want, and I'm not too judgmental about your homework, so don't worry. I'm not going to chew you out or anything like that. But yeah, give it a test and see if you can kind of get some insights into the way the tool works, or just jump into the forum and ask some questions about how. Like there were some great questions in the chat today about, well, is this a common setting? Is this the way that you would recommend to set this field or this value? That's a great space for those questions, and I encourage everyone to participate in that conversation about those settings too, because I have opinions, but thank you very much for your time.